Good evening. My name is Adam Stevenson, and I'm very happy to introduce to you guys Deacon Omar Gutierrez. Now we redacted this thing, and now I'm missing with the lines. Oh my goodness. Okay, there we go. Deacon Gutierrez is the president and co-founder of the Evangelium Institute and the director of the Society for the Propagation of the Faith for the Archdiocese of Omaha. He's also the author of a very fine book, The Urging of Christ's Love, the Saints, and the Social Teaching of the Catholic Church, published in 2013. He has a program on Catholic social teaching through discerninghearts.com. So without further ado, Deacon Omar. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for being here this evening. Why don't we start with a prayer, as this is the month of October, and pray to Our Lady, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. The Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So my presentation this evening is going to follow a number of steps here. We're going to try to get at some truths about the Catholic faith as best we can and avoid those noises as well as best we can. If I'm cutting you off, why don't I move over here so I don't get in the way of the camera. Evening, everybody. We'll cover some ground rules, voting in general, just time for a broader vision, and then we'll talk about conscience, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. Usually I try to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then try to give as much possible time to question and answer as I possibly can, so that we're on the same wavelength. So I'll start first with some ground rules. So the first one, of course, is the one from St. Augustine, which says, in essentials, unity, and non-essentials, diversity, in all things, charity. And this is important for us to remember as Catholics, of course, especially when we're talking about the election, and elections bring up all sorts of emotions, and there's a lot of tensions, and it seems to have gotten rather heated in the last 4+ years. So it's really very important we keep that in mind these days, especially as we talk to each other as Catholics. So that's just a good ground rule in general. Another ground rule is the law. According to the IRS, as a 501c3, as St. Patrick's Parish, I work for a 501c3 through the Evangelium Institute. I'm a deacon as well. I'm barred by law from mentioning or talking about endorsing candidates or parties. I cannot endorse or condemn a specific candidate or party, and I'm not going to do that this evening. And so if you bring up a question where you might try to lead me in that direction, I'm just going to not answer the question. I'm going to try to answer in a different way. The reason for that is because of the Johnson Amendment, which passed in 1954. It was named after then Senator Lyndon B. Johnson. He was experiencing some troubles in Texas, where he was from. Some 501c3s were criticizing him, and they were non-religious 501c3s. And so he approached the Senate and asked them to pass this law. And of course, the senator said, an opportunity to keep people from talking bad about us? Absolutely. So they barred 501c3s from talking about candidates. However, you should also know there's nothing in Catholic theology that bars us from speaking about candidates or parties. This really is just strictly the law. Prior to 1954, Catholic churches, Catholic bishops, Catholic priests, Catholic institutions, we did talk about parties, we did talk about institutions and candidates, because that's been the tradition for a very long, long time. It's really just the law that sort of keeps us from doing that. Now, that having been said, the IRS does say that I am allowed to talk about public policy, right? So whereas I cannot condemn a party or a candidate or endorse a party or a candidate, I can speak about or condemn or endorse certain public policies. Now, the problem is, as I'm sure you've already sort of guessed, the problem is that there's a tension there because oftentimes certain public policies are associated with certain political parties, right? So let's say we have a political party A, and the political party A has 3 policies that are sort of the pillars of what everybody knows political party A to be about. The first pillar is outlawing texting in movie theaters, which I think we all agree is important to do. The second one is subsidizing Free Pie Wednesday at Village Inn. Again, reasonable, logical, and important legislation. And the third one is rounding up guys named Omar for extermination, right? So everybody knows this is what political party A stands for. Okay? Now, when the Catholic Church then, or a deacon, right, stands up and says, hey, you're not allowed to do that, right? Everybody knows that the church is talking about political party A. Political party A knows it, the church knows it, and guys named Omar know it. So the thing is that people then start saying that the deacon or the church or the pastor, whatever, is being partisan because they're talking about a specific public policy, but that's not true, right? A, it's not a violation of the law, A. And B, the fact of the matter is that the church has an obligation, a moral obligation, that goes back to the theology I was talking about before, to speak out in defense of the poor, of those who are marginalized, stand up for the truth in every situation. And if it hurts your or my favorite political party or candidate, it doesn't matter. Right? And just kind of, again, it's kind of a ground rule. My job, I think, this evening is simply present you with what the church teaches unapologetically, right? Whether it hurts or helps anybody's favorite political party or candidate. Right? All right. So I'm going to be using this document with the U.S. bishops, first published in 2007. Since 2007, this is Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. It was first published in 2007 by the U.S. bishops. It's been tweaked every 4 years. This year, they put it out again. They added a new introductory letter to it in 2019. But other than that, it's been pretty much the same. They've changed a few things, little things here and there. I think it's important to know that when it passed in 2007, the U.S. bishops got together and they voted for it, and it was a unanimous vote in favor of it, which doesn't happen. Right? It's really very rare for the bishops to vote unanimously for one thing. And so this passed in 2007 unanimously, and that's an important thing to keep in mind as we're going forward. And that's what I'm going to be leaning on and quoting later on as we talk about voting and voting as a Catholic. All right, so the next thing is voting as a Catholic, sort of the broader vision, some general questions. The first question is, do I have to vote? Right? Am I morally obliged to vote as a Catholic? And the answer is yes. Yes, we are obliged to vote. It fulfills several of the social teachings principles, solidarity, subsidiarity, and participation. We absolutely do have to vote. It's a moral obligation. The bishops will say in their document that there could be situations where you find yourself where the choices are just so bad that you abstain from voting for that particular race or that particular office, right? But they say that should be very rare, and I would add it should be really very rare. Right? I really can't imagine that many situations where the candidates are just so bad you have no other choice. In several of the different races, you can write in a candidate, after all, so you can still fulfill your moral obligation by writing in somebody who could hold the office, and in those cases, you should do that because we do have a moral obligation to vote. The second question is, do I have to vote as a Catholic? Right? Do I have to vote as a Catholic? And technically you don't, right? But if you want to claim to be Catholic, you should, because that's what we call integrity. Right? Now, if I'm a Catholic and I believe I'm a Catholic, then I should allow my Catholic faith to influence my voting. We'll talk more about that in a second. But the reason I bring this question up is because I have another question sometimes brought to me that says, but isn't that imposing my faith on other people? Right? Shouldn't there be a separation between church and state? No, it's not imposing your faith on other people any more than they're imposing your faith on you or non-faith on you when they vote. And what's more, we can set aside the question of separation of church and state and whether it was actually in the Constitution or just in a letter from Thomas Jefferson. Let's set all that stuff aside. Right? Nowhere in the history of the United States was it ever said that somehow I need to cordon off or block off or quarantine my conscience informed by my faith from the way I vote or act in public life. That has never been an argument in the public square in America until relatively recently. Right? So as a Catholic, yes, I need to bring my Catholic background to my voting. Right? And it's not an imposition, it's not theocracy to allow my Catholic faith to inform how it is I vote. To vote as a Catholic, do I have to vote for one of the two major parties? Right? The answer to that is no, you don't. You really don't have to. Now, I say this because it comes up all the time, and I've heard this being said by well-meaning people where they'll say, you know, if you don't vote for one of the two major parties, you're wasting your vote. Right? But that really gets at the fundamental question is, well, what are we trying to do when we vote? What's the goal of voting? What's the purpose of voting? Right? What are we trying to accomplish? Typically, because there is the real tension here, right? When we look at politics, politics is this kind of art from the Greek background, this art of trying to bring about some change in society to advance, hopefully, the common good. We'll just put it that way, okay? And that requires control. It requires pursuing power. So it requires winning, right, to a certain degree. So that's true, right? But while that's the goal of politics, should that be my goal? Right? Is that my obligation as a Christian? Typically, we tend to think that it is, right? That the reason we vote is to win. And so long as we win, we're fulfilling our moral obligation. But that's actually not the purpose of Catholic voting. We're not being faithful only if we win. We're answering when we vote the moral obligation to be faithful to Christ first and faithful to our neighbor. That's why we're voting. To try to bring about the common good, to try to bring about the most good for other people, that's why we vote. And it's not necessarily to win. Now, does that mean that you're a bad person if you vote for one of the two major party candidates? No, I'm not saying that at all. Right? All I'm saying is that the very common habit, and I've heard it many, many times, of telling other Catholics that you're a bad Catholic or you're wasting your vote by voting for a third party candidate or writing in a candidate, that Catholics need to stop doing that. Right? Because that's not exactly, it's not really why we vote. Okay? All right. So those are some of the ground rules, some larger vision. Now I want to get to conscience, because the name of the document is Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. I hear a lot of people talking about conscience of Catholics over the years, and it's one of those areas that is sometimes kind of misunderstood. So I want to talk about that some more. So what is the conscience? Here's kind of my diagram, which I'll be going over several times. You'll see this several times this evening, about how conscience works. So we want to achieve some good end down here. And we use our reason, and our reason is informed by facts, to try to achieve that good end. So as I'm trying to think through how to achieve that good end, I'm going to come up with some means to achieve that good end. At this point, then, my conscience kicks in, and it says that that means is good or bad. And clearly I have a Canadian conscience because he ends his sentences in A. My wife's Canadian. That's my little joke. You're allowed to laugh. It's okay. So after my conscience says it's okay, go ahead and do that, then my will kicks in and makes a judgment to go ahead and do the action. And then I go ahead and do the action, and hopefully I achieve my end, right? That's where the conscience kind of works in this whole thing. The conscience is part of the intellect, which includes the reason and the will, so it's part of that process. And prudence, which is one of the great virtues, prudence helps you in every single aspect of this whole process, right? Prudence helps me figure out what facts to pay attention to, what the good end is, how to get there, what the best kind of way of the action is, right? Prudence helps me through the whole process, okay? All right, so that's how conscience works in. Prudence is defined as right reason applied to action, and conscience is a voice in the mind. That's just the easiest way to kind of put it. A voice in the mind that speaks to us about good and evil in a specific situation. This is what the Catechism is going to say about this. Now, in paragraph 1777, moral conscience, present at the heart of the person, enjoins him at the appropriate moment to do good and avoid evil. So in general, it kind of tells us to do good and avoid evil. St. Thomas Aquinas calls this synderesis. Right? But it also judges particular choices, approving those that are good and denouncing those that are evil. So in the specific situation, my conscience is going to kick in and say, hey, don't do that. Or, yeah, you should probably do that, right? In a specific situation. The Catechism goes on and says that a human being must always obey the certain judgment of his conscience. If he were deliberately to act against it, he would condemn himself. There's a beautiful quotation here from now Saint John Henry Cardinal Newman. The question sometimes I'm often asked is, does a Catholic have to follow their conscience always? And the answer is yes. If it's a certain judgment of your conscience, if your conscience is telling you that is the right thing to do, you should do the right thing. And if your conscience is telling you, don't do that, then don't do it. And if you violate your conscience, that could be a significant sin, depending on the circumstances. Now, the problem is, as we have this sort of national conversation about conscience and voting and Catholics and all that stuff, a lot of Catholics stop right there. They'll say to me, oh, okay, so what you're telling me is that so long as my conscience tells me it's okay, therefore it's good, therefore I should do it, therefore it's always right? No, I'm not saying that. Because the Catechism also says this: faced with the moral choice, conscience can make either a right judgment in accordance with reason and the divine law, or, on the contrary, an erroneous judgment that departs from them. Your conscience can be wrong. And sometimes it can be fantastically wrong. So how is it that this is possible? If this is a voice in my head, and honestly, some of the church fathers, some of the great theologians, John Paul II says the conscience is the voice of God in your head and is that secret place where you should commune with God. How is that possible? My conscience can be wrong, but at the same time I have to follow it. Here's three situations, three ways. One way is, here's my diagram again. One way is that I get bad facts. Right? Either somebody lies to me about what the situation is, right? Or they tell me only half-truths, about they only give me enough information so I do the thing that they want me to do. Or let's say I kind of know what the facts is, but I don't want to dig too deeply, because I know if I dig too deeply, I'll come up with facts that mean I can't do what I really want to do, so I don't do that. Let's say I'm just completely lazy, right? I'm not actually trying to get it, I'm just lazy. I don't want to do the research because I don't want to get at the truth, because it might lead me off the beaten path. Whatever the case, sometimes I'm culpable, sometimes I'm not. Bad facts are going to affect my reason, and when they affect my reason, they're going to affect the way I'm going to get to my good end. Right? So bad facts are then going to give me an erroneous judgment, and then I fail to get my good end. So that's the first way, okay, that a conscience can be wrong. Again, in some cases, I'm guilty of a sin. In some cases, I'm not. The second way, I mentioned prudence before as a virtue, but we also have this thing called vice. And what vices do is that the vice sees the good end, and it says, let's say we want to reach the good end. I'll use the example of pie. I want to eat a lot of pie because I had dinner tonight, and again I need dessert because I had to come out here. So my vice wants to get at the good end, and that's pie. And so because my vice is gluttony, it sweeps away reason and conscience, and the only process I go through then is to skip that and go right to the will, and it says my vice, the vice of gluttony says, eat more pie, eat more pie, eat more pie. Now my conscience could be screaming at me and saying, put down the fork and walk away. But I can't even hear my conscience anymore because I'm stuck in this loop of vice. Now, interestingly, so you might say, so how is this conscience being wrong? Well, right, so you've probably all had this experience. In fact, this is a universal human experience. I was a principal for a little while before I decided to walk away because it was going to kill me. But there was a little kindergarten boy who had hit a girl over the head with one of those paper towel tubes. And so he was sent to my office. So this poor little kid is standing in front of me, shaking his little black shoes. And I asked him, I said, why'd you hit her? And this little boy looked up at me and he said, I don't know. I like her. I want to be good. Yeah, and it took me all my power not to laugh at the poor kid. He was just so cute, right? But that little boy expressed was an absolutely universal human experience. Absolutely universal human experience. We all know what it's like to want to be good. St. Paul actually talks about this in Romans. We want to be good. We end up doing that thing which we know is sinful. And so as we're struggling in this, sometimes, you've had a hard day, you come home, we'll just stick with the pie analogy. You come home and there's a voice in your head that says, you need to eat a little pie. This is a pie day. Go ahead and warm up the pie and have the pie. Have another slice. You had a bad day. Have another slice. There was the guy who cut you off. Remember that thing? And there was the other thing. Remember what happened last week? You need to have another piece of pie. And that little voice, which you might think is your conscience, is telling you, go ahead and have the pie, have the pie, have the pie. And before you know it, you've eaten the entire pie in one sitting. And then that exact same voice then says to you, you're disgusting. What's the matter with you? You just ate a whole pie. What's wrong with you? Who does that? Right? Okay, that's not your conscience. That's the enemy, okay? Don't you have to, everybody right here, right? We know exactly what we're talking about. So there is the enemy does this to us, right? That's how the enemy works. That's what he's referred to as the accuser. He will tell us, you deserve this, you deserve this, you deserve this. And then once we do it, then he's the one who accuses us and say, you're a sinner. God doesn't love you. Right? So there's a discernment process that has to happen. This comes with age and maturity, where I can distinguish between the voice of my conscience and the voice of the enemy. Because sometimes they can sound alike sometimes. Right? So that's the second way. Right? The third way is this, and it's just a malformed conscience. Okay? So what we call a malformed conscience. And what does that mean, and what does it look like? Let's just talk a little bit here about what it means. The Catechism says, conscience must be informed and moral judgment enlightened. A well-formed conscience is upright and truthful. It formulates its judgments according to reason and conformity with the true good, willed by the wisdom of the Creator. The education of the conscience is indispensable for human beings who are subjected to negative influences and tempted by sin to prefer their own judgment to reject authoritative teachings. I always laugh when I read that last sentence because that's just so true, right? St. Paul has this wonderful line in his first letter to Timothy where he says, he's writing to his friend Timothy. It's, the year's like 56, 57 AD, and he says, Timothy, can I call you Tim? He says, there will come a time when people with itching ears will seek for themselves teachers of their own liking. There will come a time, and we're living that time, because that's totally normal human nature, where we go seek whatever person that wants to tell us what we want to hear. Right? And so the Catechism is simply saying that that's going to happen, so we need to be careful that we form a well-formed conscience. What does a badly formed conscience look like? A malformed conscience look like? The example overused, and it's an extreme example, but it's an example that sort of comes to the point, is there was a case in Pakistan, and the only reason I know about it is because there's a wonderful Pakistani priest who comes to Omaha every year, and some of my work with the Propagation of the Faith Office, I get to work with this Pakistani priest. But I was looking at some of the news there, and there was a woman who was caught speaking to a man in public who was not an immediate member of the family, not her father, not a brother, or a first cousin. And under Sharia law, that's completely not right. And so in certain Muslim nations, if you do that, you have the right, the legal right, then, to do harm upon your daughter if you're the head of the family. Now in Pakistan, it was against the law, so they arrested her, and she went to jail for being seen talking to this gentleman. They were just talking. But Pakistan is trying to kind of update, become more modern, and get away from some of the more sort of strict versions of Sharia. And so the judge in the case dismissed it and said, we're not going to penalize this woman, which the penalty would have been death. We're not going to penalize this woman for this crime. And so they released her. Right? And as she's, you can look this up, as she's coming out of the courthouse, there's this big crowd, and everybody's kind of fighting about what's going to happen. And somebody just comes up to her and shoots her, and shoots her dead. Right? And the crowd cheers. Why? Because from their perspective, right, this was the right thing to do. This was justice. This is what the law demands. That's a malformed conscience. These are people who have been brought up to believe for generations that this was the way these situations are handled, and when it wasn't handled that way, they took justice into their own hands. Now, this is not a disparaging statement about everybody who's Muslim. My point is that that's what it looks like, right? Now, St. Thomas Aquinas is going to say, well, even in those situations, they should just know it's wrong. Yes, but Thomas Aquinas is still going to say, yes, that's a malformed conscience. So we have to form our consciences well. So the Catechism then says the education of the conscience is a lifelong task. The education of the conscience guarantees freedom and engenders peace of heart. So this is an important point, too, because sometimes, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, people come up to me and they'll say, okay, Deacon Omar, if that's your real name. Like, I went to Catholic school for 12 years. I know my conscience is well-formed, okay? So I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. And on the inside, I just kind of want to say, yeah, but you're 60 now, right? That 12 years of Catholic education was a long time ago. And it's entirely possible that in between that time, your conscience could have been malformed. Malformed by our culture, malformed by any number of various things. Right? So we always have to be careful. Why? Because what the Catechism said, because of that little boy I mentioned, right? Or because of what St. Paul said about the itching ears. The tendency we have as human beings is to go seek those people that tell us what we want to hear. That's our tendency. And so we always have to be on the guard to make sure that we're trying to stay true to what the church teaches. So how do we form our consciences? For younger people, of course, through our parents, through our teachers. Thank God we have good teachers. Through our laws. So when our government says that when you lie under oath, when someone's life or property is on the line, that's perjury and we can jail you or fine you seriously, that says something to us about what we as a culture feel about truth and what we as a culture feel about life and property. That communicates truth, right? That helps form us to some degree. Our culture, our literature, movies, music. So again, what kind of movies are we watching? What sort of shows are we watching? Maybe you've done this, and I want to presume you're as bad as I am, but you know, I will go through and like the Prime or Netflix or whatever and look at any number of various old movies, and I say, oh yeah, I remember that movie when I was a kid. I'm going to show that movie to my kids. And then I look at it and I'm like, my dear Lord, I can't believe I showed this to my kids. Right? So we get inured sometimes to the sorts of things that are in movies and things. Or why is it that dads are always portrayed as morons in TV shows and in film and in other areas? Right? We're always stupid or mean, right? Or mean because we're stupid. Right? So all those, what does our culture say about women? The way women should be treated, or the elderly and how the elderly should be treated? Or how do we talk to each other about children? I hope this has never happened to you, but I know we have 5 kids. We just had our 5th a few months ago, thank the Lord. But, people coming up to us in the grocery store and saying things like, or giving us looks, you know what I'm saying. You know how to avoid that, right? That kind of thing. Right? How do we talk to each other about children in our society? Right? All of that forms the conscience. And our friends, the friends we keep, and then finally the faith, which I mentioned not because it's the least important, but because it's the most important. To have a Catholic conscience is to be informed by the teachings of the Catholic faith. Everybody has a conscience by virtue of the fact they're a human being. Right? If you're a human being, you have a conscience, period. Right? The choice we have is to how we're going to form that conscience. And if we claim to be Catholic, then we should be forming it by the teachings of the Catholic Church, as the Catholic Church presents that. And again, because we have this tendency to want to seek out those teachers to tell us what we want to hear, we want to make sure that we have a conscience that's formed by the rightful authority of the Catholic Church, not Father McGillicuddy, who's going to tell me what I wanted to hear, right? Or my best friend from high school who's just going to say, yeah, those were the great days, right? But by the teachings of the Catholic Church. That's what forming our conscience really means. Finally, it says it is important for every person to be sufficiently present to himself in order to hear and follow the voice of his conscience. This requirement of interiority is all the more necessary as life often distracts us from any reflection, self-examination, or introspection. Right? We all have, I'm pretty confident that we all have in our purse, in our pocket, some little black box that has the world in it. We can search anything and look at anything whenever we want. Right? That's a big distraction. And it keeps a lot of us from that requirement of interiority. And so one way to do that, one way to avoid that is how do we form our conscience? By making sure we spend time, sometimes regularly, right, to spend time with our conscience. And thankfully, as Catholics, we have the sacrament of reconciliation to do that, where we sit down and take a pause and say, what have I done? What's pricking my conscience? What should I look back, and why did I do that? And then, thankfully, talk to a priest about that, and hopefully they can help me. Or if you do the examine prayer, which is a great spiritual practice, at the end of the day, look through your day and do an examine prayer, examine your conscience every single day. Those things help to form the conscience as well. All right. Now, from those sort of general things, now we start to get into the nitty-gritty about voting and what the U.S. bishops are asking for and telling us in forming consciences for faithful citizenship. So the first thing this is that we should do good and avoid evil. Now, obviously that's what a conscience tells us, but they say some more. They also say that when we're doing good, it can be difficult to talk about it in any kind of meaningful way because the fact of the matter is there can be lots of different facts and lots of different ways at achieving the same good end. Right? And that's the hard part. For some of us, for people like me, it's actually kind of the fun part because I can work out by looking at public policy and looking at social science and looking at other things. What's the best way to achieve the good end, let's say, reducing poverty? Let's say the good end is I want to reduce poverty. Well, good Catholics can disagree about the best way to do that. So doing good, there are several ways to achieve the same good end, and we can disagree about those things, and we shouldn't be questioning each other's fidelity to Christ because you have a different way of achieving the good end of lowering poverty versus me. Right? We should be able to disagree with that charitably. And so the bishops say, look, there are lots of different ways to do that. At the end of the document, they have some specific suggestions and public policy prescriptions for that. But again, even in those situations, they would say, good Catholics can kind of disagree. So they spend a lot of their time, actually, talking about how we get to the common good and how we make sure that we maintain the common good. We're not going to go to the definition of the common good too much here tonight, but just to say the common good is that sum total of conditions that allows us all to be better persons, better versions of ourselves, and to give everybody sort of a sense of being able to reach their human fulfillment. And in a certain sense, you can call that social justice. All right. So the bishops spend a good deal of their document in the first part, and the first part is the longest part, on avoiding evil. And I'll spend a good deal of time on that this evening as well. This is what they say in paragraph 22. There are some things we must never do as individuals or as a society because they are always incompatible with the love of God and neighbor. Such actions are so deeply flawed that they are always opposed to the authentic good of persons. These are called intrinsically evil actions. They must always be rejected and opposed and must never be supported or condoned. So there are lots of bad things in our society. Lots and lots of bad things. And what the bishops are trying to do is they're trying to give Catholics, all right, in the list, the bucket of all the bad things that are happening in this world, how do I begin to sift some of that out? The bishops start to help us do that by saying, well, there are some bad things that are always and everywhere wrong. And they're so wrong that a Catholic cannot support and must oppose them. These are called intrinsically evil acts. These are evil actions which are so deeply flawed, that's their language, that the intention and circumstances don't matter. So it doesn't matter what you were trying to do. It doesn't matter what the situation was. They're always wrong. They're always evil. A Catholic may never engage in them or support them. And in fact, a Catholic has moral obligation to oppose them. So it's not just good enough that you say, well, I didn't support that policy. The church is saying, the bishops are saying, that's not good enough. What are you doing, whether voting or just in your personal life, what are you doing to oppose, to make sure that evil does not perpetuate in society? Because it's that bad. It's that bad. All right, so that's one way they help us sort of sift through the avoiding evil. Another way they do that is by giving us a hierarchy. Right? They take these intrinsically evil acts and they divide them into two different categories, or two different levels. Now, at this point, I'm going to take a quick pause, just note that those who criticize this document, and there are folks who criticize this document, several of them, who will say intrinsically evil acts is not helpful because not everything that's intrinsically evil is seriously bad. And the example of that would be lying. Right? In other words, lying is always wrong. And we can quibble about what a lie is, but if it is in fact a lie, when you agree that it's a lie, it's always and everywhere wrong. It's never right to lie, right? But sometimes a lie does not always result in somebody's death, right? Sometimes it's not even serious. This is what we call white lies, right? So it may be wrong, but it's not exactly serious. And so the critics of the bishops are going to say, that's why we don't like intrinsically evil acts as a category. But the bishops say, actually, we're trying to help Catholics, again, filter through all the different kind of bad things, categorize them, and we're going to tell you what specifically the kinds of bad things we're talking about. And this is what they say. There are some evil actions that are direct and deliberate attacks on innocent human life. And there are some that are direct and deliberate attacks on human dignity. And those qualifying words are really very important. Direct, deliberate, and then in the first instance, innocent human life. And this is the hierarchy. These are the worst, and these are the second worst. And then they actually go so far as to give us examples of these that are in play in public policy. So in the first category, we have things like abortion, euthanasia, human cloning, genocide, embryonic destructive research, and targeting of non-combatants in terror or war. If you have public policies that support those things, that's really, really bad. In the second category, we have torture, racism, redefining marriage, treating the poor as disposable, treating workers as mere means to an end, and deliberately subjecting workers to subhuman living conditions. Right? That's really bad as well. Less bad than the other one, but also intrinsically evil and bad. Okay. Here's the full list. So again, the bishops are trying to be helpful. As I'm a voter and I'm looking at all the various things that are bad in the world, we could disagree with other Catholics about the best way to achieving goods, but again, in essentials unity, right? St. Augustine's, in essentials unity. How can we avoid the bad things? I know we can argue about the good things, but how do we avoid the bad things? Here's one way to filter out all the bad things so we can make those a priority. All right. They all then move to this next section, which is called the two temptations. Right? And the first temptation is the temptation to fail to make ethical distinctions between different kinds of issues involving human life and dignity. The direct and intentional destruction of innocent human life is always wrong and is not just one issue among many and must always be opposed. This first temptation is in response to a very common argument, which is sometimes referred to as the seamless garment argument. So the argument is basically this. The seamless garment refers to the garment of Jesus and the cross, right, which the soldiers were gambling for. And it doesn't have any seams. So that's why the phrase is used. And it said, there are no distinctions between life issues. And so all life issues are equally the same. Right? And so issues like immigration, just wage or minimum wage, the death penalty, the environment, abortion, racism, euthanasia, and embryonic destructive research, they're all life issues. And since they're all life issues, they're all equally important. Right? The bishops say, no, because remember why, right? Direct and intentional, deliberate killing of innocent human life is the first category. And the second category is direct and deliberate violations against human dignity. There is a hierarchy. We need to keep that in mind. All right. So the bishops say you're not allowed to make that. These kinds of direct and deliberate intentional destruction of innocent humans is more important, right? And it's not just one issue among many. But there's another temptation. And the other temptation is to ignore other serious threats to human life and dignity by appealing only to the moral distinctions, right? So this is what's sometimes referred to as the single-issue voter problem, right? Where you might have a Catholic who will say, there's really only one issue, and that's the only one that he or she is going to pay attention to or that they can use to support a candidate. Right? So this is my one issue, this is the most important issue to me, and this is the only issue I'm going to use, and whatever candidate supports that one issue, that's the one I'm going to vote for. Right? The bishops say that's not a good idea. Why? Because you're ignoring all the other issues that are important, maybe not equally important, depends on the issue that you're really concerned about, but they're also very important. Now, part of the problem with this section is that I have met people on both camps, people who fall under the seamless garment argument and people who fall under the single-issue voter argument. But there's another aspect here that's almost never mentioned, and that's this. After the bishops say you shouldn't be a single-issue voter, they then say, but Catholics are allowed to take one issue, if it's intrinsic evil, right, and eliminate a candidate from consideration because of their support for that one intrinsic evil. So whereas you may not use one intrinsic evil to support a candidate, the bishops also say you can use one single issue to eliminate a candidate from consideration. That second part, which is right after the first part in the document, is very rarely mentioned. And it should be, because it's right there in the document. Okay? All right. What the church offers us is what Cardinal Bernardin used to refer to as the consistent ethic of life. And it's actually the language that the bishops use to this very day. And the consistent ethic of life basically sees that there are many life issues. They really are connected. Right? Immigration, the death penalty, and abortion, and just wage, and all these things, they really are connected. And we as Catholics have an obligation to try to make sure that we advance those issues as much as we possibly can. So we can't ignore any life issue, but there are distinctions. There is a hierarchy of moral issues, and we can't treat them as though they're all the same. There's a hierarchy, but they're connected. But there's a hierarchy. They're connected, but there's a hierarchy. And this is something that many popes have said. Even Pope Francis has said this. There's a hierarchy. I'll quote Cardinal Bernardin again here. He was interviewed in 1988 about these issues because some people were using him to justify the seamless garment argument. They were saying, Cardinal Bernardin says that all life issues are the same. No, that's actually not what he said. This is from the interview. He says, I don't see how you can subscribe to the consistent ethic and then vote for someone who feels that abortion is a basic right of the individual. I know that some people on the left, if I may say, use that label, have used the consistent ethic to give the impression that the abortion issue is not all that important anymore, that you should be against abortion in a general way, that there are more important issues, so don't hold anybody's feet to the fire in just an abortion. That's a misuse of the consistent ethic, and I deplore it. So the guy who came up with this ethic says the seamless garment argument doesn't work. Right? It's a misapplication of his principle. All right. Now we get to actual voting, and this is what the bishops say. Can a Catholic vote for a candidate who supports an intrinsic evil? Because that's the question everybody asks every single 4 years. Right? And here's what they say, no and yes. Now, I know this drives a lot of people crazy. When I was studying theology, I hated moral theology because it seemed like every single answer to every single question was, it depends. Right? And I kind of like clear answers. Right? And then God pointed at me and he laughed and he said, I'm going to make you a moral theologian. And then that's what he did. So we need to unpack this a little bit. No and yes. No. A Catholic cannot vote for a candidate who favors a policy promoting an intrinsically evil act, such as abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, if the voter's intent is to support that position. In such cases, a Catholic would be guilty of formal cooperation in grave evil. Formal cooperation in grave evil. So what does that look like? And this is an argument I have heard. I've heard this from very, very bright people who've made this argument, and they'll say this. I want to vote for somebody who supports abortion. And that's just the clearest example, so I'll use that example. And so they'll quote bad facts, and they'll say, if we make abortion illegal, then what's going to happen is we're going to start to have to jail, not just the doctors, but the young women who seek the abortion. And these are young women who, more often than not, are in a difficult situation, are struggling in their own lives, and we're going to throw them in jail? Right? That's not right. That's not the best way to deal with these women who are suffering and who are lost. And so therefore, in order to protect women, I'm going to vote for the candidate because they support legal abortion in order to protect these women. That is exactly what the bishops say you cannot do. You may not do that. Because the reason you're supporting the candidate is because they want to keep abortion legal. And let's address the bad fact, right? That somehow if we made abortion illegal, then that would mean we'd be jailing the women. Well, is that what we did before Roe v. Wade? All the people I've talked to said, no, that's not what we did before Roe v. Wade. So, bad facts lead to bad reasoning, which leads to bad conclusions. Okay. All right. But there is a yes here, too. So, there may be times when a Catholic who rejects a candidate's unacceptable position, even on policies promoting an intrinsic legal act, may reasonably decide to vote for that candidate for other morally grave reasons. Voting this way would be permissible only for truly grave moral reasons, not to advance narrow interests or partisan preferences, or to ignore a fundamental moral evil. So I want to point out a couple of things. Notice how the bishops repeat themselves. They're repeating themselves because they want to make you understand they're really very serious when they say you can only vote for somebody who supports an intrinsic evil for grave moral reasons. And when they say use the word grave, that should trigger something in our Catholic memory, right? There are 3 conditions for a mortal sin, right? The 3 conditions are what, right? You have to know that it's really bad, you have to freely do it, and it has to be grave matter. Right? Those are the 3 conditions. So they're using that language for a reason. They're trying to get our sort of Catholic cultural mind to remember you can only do this for truly grave moral reasons and not for these other partisan preferences. So the question ends up being, so what is morally grave matter? What counts as morally grave matter? They say, there may be times when a Catholic who rejects a candidate's unacceptable position, even on policies promoting an intrinsic legal act, may reasonably do this for truly grave moral reasons, not to advance narrow interests or partisan preferences. So it can't mean that. It can't be narrow interest or partisan preferences. So it can't be things like, I don't like that guy, or I've always voted this party. My family's always done this kind of voting. Or I really like this particular person's position on, I don't know, something frivolous. That's not a good enough reason. Simply not. In making these decisions, it is essential for Catholics to be guided by a well-formed conscience, there's that wonderful phrase again, that recognizes that all issues do not carry the same moral weight, and that the moral obligations to oppose policies promoting intrinsic legal acts has a special claim on our consciences and in our actions. So in this section, when they say only truly grave moral reasons can justify voting for a candidate who supports an intrinsic evil, they define truly grave moral reasons as other intrinsic evils. So what does that look like practically speaking? I have 2 candidates. One supports 1 intrinsic evil, the other one supports 3 intrinsic evils. Right? I could vote for this guy, even though he supports an intrinsic evil, if I think doing so would block that guy from winning because he supports 3. That would be a scenario in which, yes, I could vote for this person who supports an intrinsic evil. Not because I want that intrinsic evil to be instantiated in law, but because by doing so, I think I'm advancing the common good and blocking that. That's a truly grave moral reason. That make sense? Another scenario. Remember the distinction of the different kinds of intrinsic evils? We had things like torture and racism, redefining marriage, etc., abortion, euthanasia, human cloning, genocide. What if, when I'm looking at this candidate A, his 1 intrinsic evil results in 2,000 deaths per day? Let's say genocide, right? And the other guy's intrinsic evils are torture, marriage, and treating workers poorly. Redefining marriage. So this is the direct and intentional killing of innocent human life. This is an intrinsic evil, but less so. A Catholic could argue, well, I'm going to support candidate B because this is way more evil, even though there's 3 on this side and 1 on this side, because this will result in millions of people dying. And that's going to result not in people dying, but people suffering. Those would be the kind of calculations a Catholic would have to make in their consciences, right? And maybe in consultation with others. All right. These decisions should take into account a candidate's commitments, character, integrity, and ability to influence a given issue. In the end, this is a decision to be made by each Catholic, guided by a conscience formed by Catholic moral teaching. So, first of all, character and integrity do matter. Right? So if I have a candidate who says, I'm going to come in and I'm going to get rid of this, or I'm going to do this, and you don't believe a single thing that candidate says, well, that might be a reason why not to vote for that person. Right? Another thing is the ability to influence the given issue. So if the candidate says, let's say they're for euthanasia or something, but they're running for dog catcher, well, you're not going to pass policy on euthanasia in a dog catcher. Right? So that's not going to enter into the problem or the question of my calculation to vote for you or not. And then finally, again, just to put a point on it, we need to be formed by Catholic moral teaching and not our own preferences, as I've mentioned before. It is important to be clear that the political choices faced by citizens not only have an impact on general peace and prosperity, but also may affect the individual's salvation. Pope Benedict XVI, in his recent reflection on the Eucharist as the sacrament of charity, challenged all of us to adopt what he calls a Eucharistic form of life. Right? So just to be aware, these things have effect, yes, in the public square, yes, on cable news, yes, on Twitter, yes, and all these things, but more importantly, they have an effect on our souls. Right? If we don't really take the time to think about these things clearly, then it could affect our own salvation. This means that the redeeming love we encounter in the Eucharist should shape our thoughts, our words, and our decisions, including those that pertain to the social order. The Holy Father called for Eucharistic consistency on the part of every member of the Church. And so as we're preparing then to vote, we should go to confession. We should pray the Novena, which has already started for the election. Spend time before the Eucharist, right? Ask the Lord to help us know how to vote and how to approach these various public policy issues. Check out party platforms, paying attention to their positions, and pay attention to other races besides the presidential race. Things like Ballotpedia and Ballot Hero are really nice resources you can use to find out more about what's on the particular ballot. For the judges, when I first moved here and started voting for judges, I thought, well, how do I know which judges are right? So you go to the Nebraska Bar Association. They have a list of all the judges, and the lawyers grade the judges, and the lawyers decide. They say, well, this guy should come back, this guy shouldn't come back, whatever. So go look those up, right? Go find those. It doesn't take that long, and write down the names, and then take them to the ballot booth with you. But do your homework so that you're offering a real choice to advance the common good. All right, so that's all I have. And now we're going to open up for Q&A. So it was about 40 minutes, maybe a bit longer. And I want as many questions as possibly can, so keep that in mind. And when you ask a question, I just ask that there's a question mark at the end of it. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah, so for those watching, there seems to be evil not just in our country, not just in the media, but also within the church, a lot of division in families. And that's true, and that there's been division for a long, long time. When you look at the history of the church, you know that division's kind of par for the course. It's sad. It would be wonderful if we could have unanimity amongst pastors, even amongst bishops, even for the truth, but that doesn't always happen. So when we have that disunity, especially with regard to things like voting, my suggestion always is to go back to this particular document, Forming Consciences. And why? Well, because the bishops put it together, our bishops, and they voted unanimously for it. So even though today you might have one bishop here and one bishop there saying different things than what the document says, I'd always go back to the document and say, yeah, but this is what the bishops have all said, and that should be the standard. And then the catechism, of course, is always really helpful as well. That should be the true source for Catholic faith. Yes, sir, back there, and then over here. Yeah. Right, so the persons who dictate it is basically the Catholic Church. So if it's a direct and deliberate attack on an innocent human life, then that's the definition of what would make an intrinsic evil. So then you just have to look at the situation. And does it meet that category? If it is, then that's an intrinsic evil. Right? That category of intrinsic evil has been around for a very, very long time. It goes all the way back to Thomas Aquinas even before that. And so that's kind of where it came from. There is a longer list of intrinsic evils. That's in the Second Vatican Council and Gaudium et Spes, they have a longer list. The list that's in this document, they put together based on the kinds of things that are at play within the American sort of political conversation. And that's how they came up with that list. Thanks, yeah. Yes, sir.
Get that Ballotpedia.
Ballotpedia?
Never.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I just want to find out where to go.
Yeah, absolutely. There you are. Oh, I see. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead. So the question is, how are we as a church forming consciences? Well, so we do it in lots of ways. So we do it through our Catholic schools is one way. So our Catholic teachers, for those of you who don't know, I work full-time for the Evangelium Institute. Part of my job is going, and I meet with Catholic school teachers regularly, and we go through the catechism, and we're going through the scriptures, and we're just providing formation for the teachers, so that when they pass that formation off to the students, it's coming from a good grounding. So that's one way we do it, is by forming the teachers and the teachers forming the students. We do it also through our parishes in the sense of the pastors who have the homilies. In the confessional, there's forming of consciences in there, hopefully. We do it through our universities, hopefully. That doesn't always happen, right? But we hopefully do it through our universities. But there is this thing where the church can do so much, but ultimately it's our responsibility to do it. So the church offers a lot, and we have plenty of resources. And the fact of the matter is, in case you weren't aware of this, the laity have more access to more catechesis today than laity have ever had at any time at any point in human history ever. You all have more access to the truths of the faith than any Catholics have ever had, ever. So the church is doing a lot to make it available to you, lay people and priests and deacons and everything in between. So it is ultimately, though, up to us to take advantage of that, to make sure that as parents, certainly, and I have kids myself, to make sure I'm passing on to them and encouraging them and giving them the resources to be able to form their consciences in the end. Because ultimately, even though we're doing all these things in the parishes, in the schools, et cetera, when our students, when our young people, when they go off and have their own lives, they're not necessarily coming to Mass, they're not in the Catholic schools, not necessarily going to a Catholic university, so they need to be able to be trained to know how to form their consciences outside of the confines of Mother Church. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so the question was, you go on YouTube and you see these priests who do pick one political party and condemn people for voting for one political party, et cetera. And so the question is, are they violating the law? Yes, they're violating the law. Right? Now, they might argue it's an unjust law, and so therefore I don't have to follow it. And the church teaches that too, right? Thomas Aquinas says if it's an unjust law, then you don't have an obligation to follow it. But then, with a couple of these cases, we're not mentioning names, but with a couple of these cases, it's not just a matter of violating the law, it's also bad theology. Right? It's when you see, I think, a priest on YouTube saying those kinds of things, condemning whole swaths of people without knowing them at all, simply because of who they voted for, it's probably a pretty good sign that they're engaged in bad theology. In some of these cases, the bishops have come forward and said, silence them, or said, you're not allowed to talk about this anymore, et cetera. For me, St. Thomas Aquinas has said this, one of the greatest virtues that we never talk about as Americans, because we don't like talking about it, is obedience. And so if a diocesan priest or a priest is not going to be obedient, then that's a clue to me, too, that maybe I shouldn't trust his theology. No, so the question was, do I think some of these intrinsic evils shouldn't be... Right, so the question was, should these intrinsic evils not be brought up? And I'm not saying that at all. I think the intrinsic evils should be brought up, and they often are brought up. I mean, I certainly talk about it in my columns pretty regularly and go through the whole swath of various intrinsic evils. So they should be brought up, we should be teaching, we should be forming people, we should be doing that. But when you start condemning people because they voted for a specific party without knowing anything else about the person, then that's bad theology. Yes, sir? Yeah. Sure. So the question was about the question of like church and state and separation thereof. It's an American thing, but is that really something the Catholic Church holds or purports or what? So generally speaking, the church does recognize that there are two distinct roles for church and state. The state is involved with maintaining the common good. The church is involved with getting people to heaven, right? So in that sense, there is this natural separation that should be separate. But at the same time, the church does teach, has always taught, and still teaches that the state, because it's trying to advance the common good, has an obligation to make sure it gets as many people to the best fulfillment of themselves as humanly possible. And as Catholics, we believe that the best fulfillment of ourselves is holiness, is sanctity, right? Again, another story from a little kid. This little kid once said, saints are the most peoply people. They're the most fully themselves, most fully formed, right? So in the interest then of making sure that everybody has access to being most fully themselves, states do have an obligation to make sure that people can worship as a Catholic and even promote the Catholic Church. Now, that's the ideal. The Church at Vatican II said that's the ideal, but that's not reality, right? And so you can't force anybody to be Catholic. That's completely wrong. The Church was very clear at Vatican II saying you have the right to religious freedom, so that's defended. So there is a separation, but it's not as separate as we Americans might like it to be. No. Right, so the question is, what's the church's role in addressing secular things that maybe are outside of the realm of theology, right? So a couple things. One is there are lots of areas of human involvement that touch on moral action. So instead of the environment, I'll pick economics, right? So in my background and expertise is in Catholic social teaching, and there are many people who said the Pope should stay out of economics because the popes aren't economists, they're theologians, and they should just shut up about it. But what the church has taught, Leo XIII and many others have said, yeah, but economic exchange involves moral decision-making. And insofar as it involves moral decision-making, the church actually does have a role in that. And so we should be talking about it. But your question is really kind of getting, so I wanted to say that, but your question is kind of getting at, yeah, but let's say the Pope isn't an expert in Keynesian versus Austrian economics. Like, so what role do they have in that, right? What the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith had a wonderful document in the early 90s called Donum Veritatis, where the gift of truth, where they laid out basically 4 levels of church teaching and what the responses to the teaching should be by Catholics. And most of them, none of us would have any problem with, right? So there's teachings we all have to believe in by divine faith, teachings we have to agree with, teachings we just have to submit to, right? Those are doctrines, whatever. But then there's this area called prudential teaching. And what Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, in the early 90s, said was, prudential teachings could be wrong. So let's say the bishops make an assessment about something, the way Catholics should behave in a certain situation, and that assessment is based on the information the bishops have. So if the bishops have the wrong information, or if the situation changes, right, then by the bishop's own principles, they would have to change the teaching in that particular situation. So as we're assessing those prudential teachings, a Catholic might want to ask, all right, well, what was the original teaching? What were the bishops trying to say? What's the situation now? And should I continue to follow that? What Cardinal Ratzinger says is that Catholics should not just presume that the bishops are always wrong. The presumption would be they're right. But if you do disagree with them, you need to make sure you disagree with them for the right reasons, and not just because you want what you want. And then when you do disagree with them, you don't go out and start entire companies and go after the bishops because they're wrong on this one prudential teaching. So it's okay to question in prudential matters whether or not the bishops or the pope said this or that. But you do have to be careful that you're not doing it simply because you want what you want, and you do have to give good reasons and try to seek the truth and ultimately try to get to where the pope or the bishops are if you can. Yes, ma'am.
When there's a major race like the presidential race,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not just one person, it's like president and vice president. Do you look at political party values? Do you look at the individual himself, and then how much weight do you put on the vice president versus the president?
That's a really good question. So in the presidential race, we have the president, vice president who's running, and then the political party, right? And so in a certain sense, am I voting just for the president, or for the president and the vice president, or for the party in general? Like, what am I really voting for? So that's a really important question. I guess the way I would answer it is that you look at all three. Ultimately, you're voting for the executive, you're voting for the president. And the vice president is important there, but as we all know, the vice president is usually chosen to kind of help the president get elected. The president hopefully doesn't count on dying anytime soon, so that's something to take into consideration. But I think the focus really should be on the president. Normally speaking, the president is the one who sort of runs the ship when it comes to putting together the platform for the party. That's typically the case. That's not always the case, obviously. And so when you're looking at the party platform, you do look at the party platform and say, well, is that really in line with my values or not? And then even if it is in line with my values, is that guy who's running for president really the guy to make those things happen? So those are considerations as well, and reasonable ones. I guess the ultimate thing is the vice president, I guess, is something you could consider, but not always. I know one very good Catholic lady once told me that she was voting for somebody because of who the vice president was. And I thought, well, that's great. That's fine. That's how she came about it. Yes, sir.
So, since not only our Catholic teaching, but our evaluation of facts should form our conscience
Yeah.
as we vote,
Yeah.
and the fact that, we tend to go and listen to things we want to hear in the current media,
Yeah.
you can shop to hear what you want to hear,
Yep.
regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. Does the church have any say, or should they have any say in saying, this is not true, or they're not telling the whole truth, or this side is not telling the whole truth? And I guess that's my question.
Yeah, that's good. So for those watching, I mentioned before that somebody can go, we have a tendency to look for things that agree with us. In the current media culture, we can shop and only get what we want. And so should the bishops, or do the bishops have a role in kind of telling us which news outlets or what media outlets are more reliable than others? No, not so much. I don't think they want to get in the nitty-gritty of that, because then they will, and I wouldn't necessarily want them to either, then they're really getting into an area where they become the arbiters of truth, and they have to continue to do that. So if they do that for one, they have to do that for everybody, and that can get very, very difficult. And how many times have we seen over the last several years where some news story pops up? There was a bishop in the United States who got in trouble with this a little while ago. A news story pops up, it's all over the media, and this bishop comes and condemns somebody for this action, and it turns out it was completely fabricated. Right? It wasn't the whole story. And now the bishop has to say, oh, sorry, I'm going to go apologize, right? Which he did, thankfully. So that's why I think it's not a good idea. However, the church has said the following. There was actually a whole document of Vatican II about it, and Pope Francis has actually been really blunt about this, and that is to continue to preach to journalists and those in the media that your obligation is a vocation for truth. And insofar as you're not fulfilling that vocation, you're jeopardizing your own souls. So if you're going to lie, you're taking something upon yourself that's really dangerous. So if you're Catholic, if you're Christian, and you're in the media business, you need to really focus on telling the truth above all else. They have said that, and they do say that. Any questions from online? No? That's good. Yeah. Okay. Uh-huh. Yeah, so the question is just like there's a division in the church, and you look to the church to try to figure out how to solve that division, particularly between, let's just say, as you said, the abortion side and let's say the social justice side. Yeah, again, as the question before, there's a division in the church. There's always going to be division. I think we try to follow St. Augustine's rule. I will say that one of the things that we can do positively is to try to find, because we have people on both sides who are really passionate about public policy, to try to find public policies that help unite us. And one thing in the work that I've done with the church over the last several years is like human trafficking is an issue that both sides can work together on and are really very passionate about. And so if we can do more on those kinds of issues where we bring, the divisions kind of disappear all of a sudden, everybody kind of comes together, then I think that's going to be really helpful going forward to find out, to have the conversations that maybe we hopefully get together. Yes, Father.
So I don't see any questions online. If somebody still wants to put one on there, they can. But a question, since I know we are getting closer to the time, that we're at October 29th. I know there's, according to the news anyway, that I've been watching, maybe not all the news, but there seems to be a record number of people voting early, and it seems like that's the big trend. So a lot of us here tonight, or a lot of people watching online, may have already voted already. And so we're watching this, and we're seeing things maybe that we knew, maybe that we didn't. And sometimes we tend to think, well, voting is my way of expressing my opinion and contributing. But what do we do for the rest of the next 3.5 years when we're not waiting for the next election?
Thank you for that. Yeah, so a couple of things. One, because the Catechism says that forming conscience is a lifelong practice, form your conscience, right? So read up on some of these issues. Try to get outside of our preferred box of media information and go somewhere else, right? I think that's helpful. I know I've learned a lot by doing that myself, and I see different viewpoints. And even if you're just even if you're just doing it cynically so that you know how to argue with the other side better, I don't care. But just go, like, get out and read other people's viewpoints. The other thing, too, is prudence, which I mentioned a couple of times, which we could spend much more time on. Prudence is a virtue, and another word for virtue is a good habit, right? So the prudence is something you can practice at all times, whether it's a presidential year or not, and in many different areas of your life, right? So practicing, looking at, trying to increase your prudential judgment in various areas of life is a good thing to do. And you can do that, for instance, as the social teaching will suggest, in the way we engage in our economic activity and the kinds of places we shop, and the kind of things we buy, and how much we buy. And we don't want to, sometimes I say this, and I fear that sometimes some people might think, oh my gosh, am I being a bad Catholic by buying this? I don't want to turn anybody into a neurotic, that's not the point. But the point is that we want to make sure that we're conscious about our being Catholic 24/7, and every other day of the week, not just on Sundays, right? The church has something to teach us and to tell us about what it means to be Catholic throughout every aspect of our life. And that's a beautiful thing, right? It's a beautiful thing as it invites us to do this. So we can do that at any time, in any situation. One simple thing to do is put up an image, a religious image in our home, if we haven't one already, and then pray more regularly, right? Even if it's just 10, 15 minutes a day, pray more regularly. That's a positive, solid thing we can do to help make voting easier 4 years from now or 2 years from now. Question online.
Yeah, so there is one question online, and I'll read it straight off, and then maybe follow up on that. Okay. So the question is, which party does the bishop prefer, Democrat or Republican? Which I realize from what you said before is probably, first of all, you're not the archbishop, and second, it might serve as an endorsement. So the question that I might ask, you can speak into that if you want, but also kind of going off of that, is there a Catholic party, in quotes?
Yeah, so the way I would answer that is, I used to see the Archbishop every day. I used to work with the Archbishop very closely, and he has no preferred political party. I think as Catholics, we should feel very comfortable because of what Jesus has said about our relationship with the world. We should be very comfortable at being politically homeless. That we want to pursue the truth in the best way we possibly can and advance the common good in the best way we possibly can. And if that means pursuing somebody from a different party or pursuing a different policy, then that's what it means. Having a preferred party starts to get kind of dangerous. And that's why, to your point before, when priests are condemning people because they're voting for a political party, that's where the theology is bad. So to answer the question, the bishop has no preferred political party, and the conversations I've had with him demonstrate that. Yeah, Adam.
In the, you were referencing like the division in the church and society. I always found myself like on the opposing side of somebody else and looked at things that they're interested in. I'm like, even having that social dilemma of movie, gosh, how can you be so excited about that? What's wrong with you? Like, how can you not see things my way? Like,
Yeah.
obviously the clear direction.
Yeah.
But I really kind of been thinking about it in prayer, some of the reasons that I'm so passionate about my issues is it's my lived experience, it's things that are in my life.
That's a good point.
So I think, for example, I've never really struggled with racism
Yeah.
in my life. But maybe somebody else has, so they're over there, and that's their path, that's their trigger point, that they get really passionate about, and they're out to fight for that, And although it may not be, and I have to realize, gosh, I don't feel like God's calling me to fight that fight, He's calling me in other areas, and I can be fighting this fight and not have to condemn the fight that they're fighting. Could somebody say, even though you have those categories in there, like this is a super intensive evil, this is a lesser intensive evil, but if that's that person's, that where they really feel like God's calling them to fight the fight or to make the right kind of issue, could they just, I have a hard time if my issue wasn't the primary one, but God was surely calling me to fight that one. Because I feel like I was kind of like, well, gosh, that's my thing, that's me and God's thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really very good point. So just to sort of sum it up, sometimes there are certain public policy issues that we're very much, and not just passionate about, but we really do believe God's speaking to us in the way that we pursue that public policy, and our interest in redoing research on it and advocating for it and working in the community for it, et cetera, so that when they don't see their public policy necessarily reflected in the list that was given up here, maybe it's not even intrinsic evil, maybe it's just something that they really feel passionate about, it can feel kind of alienating. Like, is the church saying my favorite policy, the policy that God's really called me to work at, that it's not important? So the first thing is to make the distinction between what the Lord's calling you to do in the everyday life and then this practice of voting. So we want to make sure that we're being faithful to what the Lord's calling to us to do in everyday life. And so this calling they have is bigger than this particular act of voting. However, I could absolutely see somebody saying to themselves, yes, and I get it, and I understand what the bishops are saying, but in my heart, in my conscience, I know the Lord wants me to advance this specific issue. And my conscience tells me, and as I've looked at the issues, I think this is what I have to vote in order to be at peace with myself. In that situation, again, if they've gone through everything and they're clear in their own conscience, I can't read into their mind and know what they know and what they don't know. I could see that person making a vote that's based just on that issue and in their clear conscience. And I could see that being a decent thing to do and not sinful at all, because they're being driven honestly in the depths, because I know people like this. I know exactly the kind of person you're talking about. In the depths of their heart, they know this is the issue that I need to dedicate my life to. And I'm not in any kind of position to condemn them for that. But outside of those kind of situations, that became a different issue. And that person also has to be very careful, and this is the flip side of it, very careful to take their issue and try to force and make everybody else that issue for them too. And that's where it kind of can spill over and gets a little bit ugly. But if in the privacy of their own conscience and as they vote, then I'm not here to judge them for that at all. Thanks for bringing that up. It's a really good point. Yes, sir, back there.
Kind of piggyback on that comment of there's a lot of racial injustice things going on, and can a person or what is the church reflection on Black Lives Matter, for example? I think that everybody in this room and most people in the world would agree that the lives of black people matter, but the organization Black Lives Matter, for me, that I've looked into it, does not necessarily reflect a lot of the church teachings. So I don't necessarily support capital BLM, but I support lowercase BLM.
Yeah.
And where do we go with those kind of things? That it seems like we're being pushed either be on this side of the issue or this side of the issue, and the church's response to something like that.
Yeah, so it's a big issue, so I just want to break it into a couple little pieces. I'm not going to be able to address all of it, but so just before I answer, I'm a first-generation American. My parents are from Latin America. My dad was from the Dominican Republic, so he was black. My mom was white from Costa Rica. When they met in Michigan, the first priest they went to marry them refused to because they were mixed race. This is Michigan in the early 60s, right? I have two brothers who are very dark-skinned. I've experienced racism myself growing up. So it's something that comes from what you were saying, like my personal experience, something that I actually do encounter. I'm not going to comment about the organization Black Lives Matter because they don't pertain to be a Catholic organization, so I shouldn't be judging what it is that they do. But with regard to the issue of racism, one thing, the U.S. bishops have a really good document. There are some quibbles with it, but talking about prudential teaching like we were before. But a really good document called Open Wide Your Heart, right? And it gets at the definition of what racism is from the Catholic perspective. As I talk to people about this issue of racism, to me, the nub of the issue kind of goes down to what are we defining as racism? Right? Because a lot of the conversation that seems to happen presumes upon definitions of racism that wouldn't match the Catholic understanding of racism. And there would be definitions that would condemn people regardless of what they have in their hearts. Or they would go against what I think is the sort of the gold standard in the United States, which is the Martin Luther King standard, right? Which is you judge people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. And if that's the gold standard, which I think it is in the United States, then that's the standard we should use. And sadly, not everybody agrees with that. Not even those who are against racism or anti-racism. So it's a complicated issue. It's an issue that's still being discussed widely and vociferously, even within the African American community. It's an issue that the media, we were talking about the media before, isn't always great about reporting on. And as I've done more and more research on it, I realize that many of us are just woefully uninformed about what racism does exist and what racism doesn't exist. And we need to have a healthy American conversation about that. Sadly, right now, I don't think we can because it's just the anger that exists. But hopefully, we can calm things down in the near future and actually start having the right conversation.
I do have one question that I think goes back to what Adam asked before about should people vote on who they think will do the best for most people or on one singular issue?
Right, so the bishop said that you shouldn't vote on one single issue. You do want to make sure that you try to advance the common good, and the common good can mean what's best for most people, but that's actually not the proper understanding of the common good. So the common good is not just what's best for everybody or what the majority desires. That's not the definition of the common good. That's called democracy, and democracy is fine, but even the Greeks understood that democracy has some drawbacks. So rather what we want to do is we want to make sure that we advance the common good in the sense that we're advancing a culture that will allow people to achieve human fulfillment. Now, how you define that it starts to get sticky and more complicated. One fundamental way the bishops and the churches define that is to vote for somebody who's going to make sure that the poor are taken care of. And by the poor, they mean, and I'm quoting from Pope Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum and Pius XI and Quadragesimo, so this is Catholic social teaching. By the poor, we mean the working poor. Right? So to try to advance society to the degree so that those who labor can have jobs, first of all, and have jobs that pay a decent wage. That's the sort of the bare minimum. And what Leo XIII is going to say, and he's saying this in 1891, in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, he's saying, if the state can help advance the needs of those people, because those are the vast majority of people, then they'll be much better off, right, for everybody else. They can tackle all the other problems easier. So that's something I've said and written about, that we want to make sure we advance society in such a way so that the working poor get jobs and can keep those jobs and get, well, good paying jobs. Yeah. All right. Right. So, right. So the question was, so does the church, I only laugh because I love the directness of your question. So does the church say that you can vote for somebody who is for abortion or not? Okay? And that goes back to my previous slide, which says no and yes. It depends. Right? So because of the situation I gave before. So let's say you have somebody who supports abortion. They support the one intrinsic evil. And then you have another candidate who supports 5 intrinsic evils and also supports abortion. Right? Okay, so that's why it depends. So in that situation, yes, a Catholic could vote for somebody who supports abortion, because by doing that, they're voting against somebody who supports not just abortion, but a whole bunch of other intrinsic evils. Right, so then the next question is, so then why not just not vote, right? Okay, so let me give you a scenario which actually is happening in the United States that might help work this out. Let's say you have a candidate there's 2 candidates, you can't write in anybody, you can only write for these 2 candidates, and one candidate wants to make abortion legal all the way up until birth. That actually happens in the United States, all the way up until birth, and they want to advance that for any reason whatsoever. You have one candidate who wants that. You have another candidate who says, I still want abortion to be legal, but I agree with 70% of the American populace that says, let's make it illegal past the 20th week. So they're still for abortion, they're still pro-choice, but they want to make it illegal past the 20th week. And that's their position. Okay? Now, I as a Catholic could say, well, I'm just not going to vote for that kind of person, right? Because they're both for abortion. But St. John Paul II said, in paragraph 74 of Evangelium Vitae, he said, in those situations, a Catholic actually could vote for the person who wants to limit abortion. Not because that person's pro-choice, but because by voting for that person, they're limiting abortion and therefore saving lives. And the point is to save lives. So it's perfectly okay if you as a Catholic say, I, in good conscience, just can't vote for either person. That's okay, right? But you can't condemn another Catholic for voting for the person who wants to limit abortion because he wants to limit abortion and save lives. Does that make sense? One's worse than the other. The point is to save lives. And if I can save lives by voting for this person, then I'm going to vote for the person. Right, so I'll touch on the religious liberty issue. So the question was started out with, what about religious liberty and that? So it is true. So interestingly enough, when Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship first came out in 2007, the original 2007 version doesn't mention religious liberty once. But it does in 2012 and it does in 2016 since then. Why? Well, because there really was an effort in the intervening years to attack religious liberty, and there are famous cases of that. We can go through that if you'd like, but I'm not going to. There were a lot of skyrocketing amount of cases where people were going after religious institutions and trying to shut them down or do various things. There is an attack, that is an agenda, it is a real thing, it is actually happening. That having been said, however, the winning streak within the courts on issues of religious liberty has been long and consistent. By which I mean, even with, so just as an example, one of the famous cases, the Hosanna Tabor Supreme Court justice case, where it was a Lutheran school and they had a minister, we don't get into all the details, and so it went up to the Supreme Court, and it was this Lutheran school in Michigan against the Obama administration, his Solicitor General. And the Solicitor General for the Obama administration says that we, the state, should be able to remove the ministerial exemption from religious organizations, which means now the state can tell churches who they get to hire and don't get to hire to be a priest. That's what it means. When the Solicitor General made the argument, Elena Kagan, who was chosen by President Obama to be on the court, said, "What?" And they voted against the Obama administration 9-0. 9-0. So even those, if you want to put it this way, on the left, on the Supreme Court and the justice system, right, understand that where some people are trying to push the country is just not going to happen. And so the precedents that have been set, and not just in that case, but in many other cases, since that happened, have been pretty regular and pretty good. So it is an issue. There are people who are trying to pick away at religious liberty. But thankfully, it's been bipartisan support for a long time to try to make sure we don't get there. At the same time, we also recognize, right, because it was one of our guys here, Judge Bescher, who's a neighbor of mine and a friend of mine, who was attacked for being a member of the Knights of Columbus. That he shouldn't be allowed to be on the court in the federal courts because he's a member of the Knights of Columbus. You know, that evil organization, the Knights of Columbus. So that happens too. So it's a reality, but I think sometimes it can overemphasize it. Yeah. Yes? Yeah.
But then they're like attacking her and saying like, should we be concerned that you're Catholic, the dogma, or thing like that? But I never really heard anybody say like should we be concerned that you're an atheist? You know,
Right.
you might have to pledge on the Bible. Should we
Yeah.
be concerned that you don't take this seriously?
Yeah, it only goes one way. Bringing up the Amy Coney Barrett thing. Interestingly enough, I mean, sadly enough, there was a hot mic moment with Senator Feinstein during the hearings where you could hear her. She didn't realize her mic was on. You could hear her say, she's really against abortion. She's really against abortion. I think it's her religion. I think it's really a religious thing for her. Why would that matter? Is your position, Senator Feinstein, the only way you could be against abortion if you were a religious person? Right? And that kind of shows you some of the prejudice that's there. But hey, Catholics have been prejudiced, discriminated against the United States since the United States began, so it shouldn't be anything necessarily new. All right. I'm more than happy to stick around and answer more questions. And if it weren't for COVID, we'd go out and have drinks or something too. But God bless you. Thank you for those who are online. And why don't we just end with a prayer again to Our Lady to bless us and to bless our nation. She's the patroness of our nation. So in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God bless you all. Thank you so much for coming out.